welcome to today's session. We're studying Jewish law, which is vital for being a Jew, right? It's one thing to know the philosophy, but it's a whole different kettle of fish to know a kettle of gefilte fish, to know what to do and how to do it, right? It's one thing to love your spouse, which is what we learn in Tanya, and it's another thing to exhibit that love. You love Hashem, that's fantastic. But the question is, how do you show that love? You gotta, it's one thing to be a Jew in your heart, but you got to be a Jew with your hands and your feet, right? You got to show up and deliver the goods, and that's what we have to learn Jewish law, which is what we're doing today on Thursdays in the Kosher Crash Course. And you can hear previous classes at youtube.com/Jewish Gardens. That's youtube.com/Jewish Gardens. Today we are moving on to a whole new subject within the content, within the crash course of kosher, maybe hopefully two subjects. One is the laws pertaining to grain. There's a very interesting law pertaining to grain, which we need to be aware of, and it's relevant especially after Pesach. Right after Pesach is when it's most relevant. So let me bring to you the verse in Torah, the Bible, which speaks explicitly about this important law. I'm going to bring it up to you right now. Okay, so I'm opening the Chumash to Leviticus chapter 23, verse 10. Here it is, verse 10. Okay. Here it is. It says in the verse. Here, okay. So it says like this. God spoke to Moses saying, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them further, as you have been taught, when you enter the land that I'm giving you and you're about to reap its harvest, you must first on the second day of Passover, before you eat the grains of the land, on the second day of Passover, you have to bring an Omer offering in the temple. On the second day of Passover, what is an Omer offering? You bring, it's 1/10 of an ephah, it's 2.5 liters or 2.6 quarts of barley, as an offering before God, like a sacrifice, as the beginning of your harvest. So the Omer is the season opening of grains. In other words, God gets first dibs, right? Like you have in the country clubs, a season opening bowl, a season closing bowl, right? You have these events, right? So at the Chabad here, we have a season opening Friday Night Live. Save the date, the last Friday night in August, by the way, is our season opening Friday Night Live over here. We're getting back on track. What? Well, you should come back before the holidays. Don't forget this year Rosh Hashanah starts Labor Day. It's a Labor Day Rosh Hashanah. Okay, whatever, fine. Anyway, so here's what it says, right? So you have to bring the Omer offering. The whole counting of the Omer relates to this. We're counting the Omer between Pesach and Shavuos. We're actually counting. It's an interesting concept. But you're obligated to bring the offering as the beginning of your harvest. Give it to the priest. Only after this may you harvest produce for your own use. Now, I'm going to continue just a little bit more, 3 more verses. The priest must wave this Omer offering of barley before God. Now, it's only one collective Omer offering, not everybody individuals, like with a Paschal sacrifice that everybody brings as in groups. But here it's one offering for the whole Jewish people. You move it back and you move it to the north and back to the starting position, then to the south and back, then to the east and back, and then to the west and back. It's kind of like the lulav, how we wave the lulav, they wave the Omer, and then raise it and lower it to the starting position, and finally lower it and raise it back to the starting position. The horizontal movements will neutralize destructive winds. Hurricanes. Aha. Hurricane windows. Reinvented, right? The horizontal movements will neutralize the destructive winds. We need wind mitigation insurance, right? And the vertical movements will neutralize destructive dews, DEWs. We don't have that problem in Florida, I don't think. If you perform this rite properly, it will attain God's favor for you. The priest must wave it on the day after the first day of Passover. The latter having been designated as the day of rest from mundane work. So the first day of Pesach is the day of rest. The second day, which only in the diaspora, by the way, is Yantiv, but in Israel it's not Yantiv, it's Chol HaMoed, it's the intermediate days. So there you wave you bring the Omer offering. After it has been waved, you must treat it as a regular grain offering, bring it to the southwest corner of the altar, remove and burn up its memorial portion of the altar, and the rest may be eaten by the priests. On the same day, as you wave the Omer of barley, you must offer an unblemished lamb in its first year as an ascent offering to God, associated with the Omer offering of barley. By the way, many of us here have learned the tractate Sota, Talmud Sota, right? that was very closely associated with the Omer. It's got a special connection to the Omer. We learned about it because you're supposed to learn Sota during the counting of the Omer period, 49 days for 49 folios of Talmud. And we learned that just like the Omer offering is the offering of barley, which is animal food as opposed to wheat, so to the Sota was the adulterous woman, was the woman that acted like an animal instead of following her human higher consciousness. Now, 2 more verses. The grain offering accompanying this lamb must be 2/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with oil, offered up on the altar as a fire offering pleasing to God, instead of the usual 1/10 of an ephah, prescribed as the grain offering accompanying an ascent offering lamb, as you have seen, and will be taught later. Even though its grain offering must be double the usual amount, its libation, the pouring, must be only a quarter of a hin, which is a liter or a quart of wine as usual. Now, here's the crux that we're getting to. We learned that you have to bring on the second day of Pesach, the Omer offering, right? We said it was first dibs for God Almighty, opens the season for the grains. You must not eat bread or anything made out of flour produced from oven-parched kernels. That's called kali in Hebrew. And carmel. Carmel means fresh kernels themselves, or anything else made out of the produce from the new harvest until this very day, i.e. until you bring God's sacrifice on the second day of Pesach. This is an eternal rule throughout your generations and in all your places of residence, even outside the land of Israel, unlike other agricultural commandments, the majority of which apply only inside of the land of Israel. And that concludes the Torah reading that we actually read on many of the Jewish holidays, Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot. And it lays the groundwork for today's Torah study of the concept of the laws, kosher crash course, the laws which are pertaining to grain. And that opens it. I see that on Facebook, we don't have anybody watching, except for one person, maybe. Maybe that's me. But Winston is telling me he's not getting the live stream on Facebook, but YouTube is running smoothly, which is why YouTube seems to have a larger audience. But yeah, I don't know. What do we do? Do we cancel and start again? I think I'm going to do that. I'm going to do that one more time. I'm going to cancel and start it again. I'm going to end the live video on Facebook, and I'm going to try again. Yeah, maybe we've been censored. Okay, let's try that one more time. Bear with me, folks. So we are still on YouTube. Thank you, Winston, for pointing that out. Gonna work out how to do that now. That was Facebook? Okay, well, nobody was on it, so it didn't seem to be working. So I'll try it again.
It's a poor workman who blames his tools.
Okay, so almost there, folks. Getting ready. Okay. All right. Starting Facebook now. Very good. Back on Facebook. Hopefully it works. Winston, let us know. It's great to have your input from Indonesia. It's great stuff, man. Or maybe you can upload to Facebook later. Okay, fine. Anyways, back to business. Let's go. So the verse states as follows. We just learned the verse in Leviticus, which says that when you come to the promised land that I'm bringing to you, that I'm giving you, and you reap its harvest, and then you will bring on the second day of Pesach the Omer offering, which is a barley offering, which is the beginning of your grain harvest to God. Any breads or anything produced from oven parched kernels or plain kernels, right? Fresh kernels themselves, or anything else made out of the grains should not be eaten until you bring this offering before God as an eternal law for all your generations, wherever you live. Now, let's see how this law applies and pertains to us on a practical level, right? Let's get into this. So the Torah prohibits us eating something called new grains, the new harvest, until after the priest in the temple waves the offering of the Omer on the day of Pesach. Because after the waving, he would bring an offering before God, and from that moment on, it was permissible to eat the grains of the season. When are you today allowed to eat the new grains of the season? Right? Today, we don't have the offering taking place in the temple. Right? So nowadays, when we don't have a temple and you cannot bring offerings before God, therefore, you are not allowed to eat the new grains until after the latest time when they could have offering, when the latest offering could have been brought. And when is that? The very end of the second day of Pesach. That's the latest time they could have brought it. Because today, since we have no temple and you can't bring the offering, the day itself, even if you don't bring the offering on the second day of Pesach, is what allows us to enjoy the new grain And that's why from that moment on, you're allowed to bring you're allowed to eat the new grain from the third day of Pesach, basically, which is the 17th day of Nisan, because Pesach is the 15th of Nisan. This would be the 17th day of Nisan. This permission, or it would actually be the sundown on the third day, or nightfall on the third day of Pesach, right? So 48 hours after the Seder, okay? Now, this permission, which by the way means that your matzah cannot be from new grain, because matzah is obviously baked before Pesach. So the matzah can never, ever, ever be made from the grain of this season. It has to be made from grain of last season. We'll talk about this a little bit more now. This permission to eat nowadays grain after the 17th of Nisan is only for produce that was produce that was harvested or at least took root in the ground before the 16th of Nisan. But before Pesach. But if you planted grain day after Pesach, let's say, or the fourth day of Pesach, right? Let's say you planted grain on the fourth day of Pesach. So now it's not exempted by this year's second day of Pesach. It's got to wait until next year's Pesach. Right, so it takes time to grow. Let's say you planted in May and it's harvested. I don't know how long it takes to grow, but let's say by August it's ready, right? You can't eat that grain. You got to put it in the silo and wait until after Pesach next year, which is when it becomes permissible, right?
I think the safest rule just to always use the prior season.
Exactly. And that's why you'll notice that when you buy kosher bread, you'll typically see on the kosher certification status, it says a word called yashan. Yashan means old grain. Why is it old grain? And why do we specifically look for old grain? Because we want to make sure that the grain is not from this season. I don't want grain that was planted in January, which I'm eating now in April for my matzahs, because that's not permissible, right? You need to be able to eating from grain that grew before last year Pesach, right? Okay.
So the grain's
You're late.
So grain to be laying around 1 year before you're using it.
Right, so think about it a second. Again, I don't know how you store the stuff, but they're the silos. That's what they do. How long you think a grain? Unless you're getting farm to table, it's going around the world, right? I want you to realize, when do you think they bake your matzah? So you eat your matzah Pesach, right? We get it here, like let's say a month before Pesach. Let's say February, let's say, right? Now that's after it arrived on a ship in a container, and God knows what else. It came from Israel or Ukraine or somewhere else. Right, we're actually working on opening a matzah bakery now in Florida, but theoretically it comes in past. It's coming from Israel or Ukraine or somewhere like that. So it was made Hanukkah time. It was made in December. The grain was reaped, was harvested November, right? So it's not like it's coming fresh. You know what I mean? It's matzah. It tastes like it's not so fresh, right? Right. Okay. Good. Now, but grain which grows in the ground. But grain which grows in which takes root in the ground after. So let's say you planted a week before Pesach, right? Planted a week before Pesach, but it didn't take root. It didn't take root until the 16th, until after the 16th of Nisan. Then it goes into next year's lot. How long does it take for something to take root? It takes 14 days, 2 weeks for food for a planted something to take root. We'll talk about that soon. I don't know if we'll get there today, but with relating to the laws of fruits, of trees, it takes 2 weeks for a tree to take root, or anything planted to take root. Now I want to say this to a comment that Keith just made, that he never thought of this. And I want you to realize something very, very interesting, is that the mitzvahs aren't just there to keep us on our toes. They're there to draw sanctity into every single aspect of our lives. To draw the presence of Hashem into every aspect of our lives, even the part of our lives we never thought about. Right? That's what we're doing with the mitzvahs. And that's why you'll notice that the mitzvahs pertain to everything. Even the way you tie your shoelaces are related to a mitzvah. Right? You're supposed to tie the right first and then the left, or whatever. Yeah, I mean, there's a whole system over there about how you cut your fingernails. There's a way how to cut your fingernails, right? There's a whole sequence. Yeah, not consecutive. There's a whole sequence. And the reason for that is because... see you later, Keith. The reason for that is because you're supposed to be able to draw sanctity and holiness, like we learned in Tanya, to make a home for Hashem in every single part of this world. Now, what kind of grain is included in this prohibition, in this law of Yashon? So it includes all the 5 kinds of grain. Now these guys hang out together, the 5 grains relating to chametz and Pesach, relating to what matzah is allowed to be made out of, and relating to the law of Yashan and Chodosh, new and old grain, which is the 5 grains: wheat, barley, spelt, oats, and rye. Included is not only the grains themselves, but also everything comes out of the grain, like it says in the verse: lechem, koli, v'karmel, bread or oven-parched kernels, which produce something, or the kernels themselves. Therefore, we have to be careful with preservatives or beer, which is made out of wheat, right, or barley, right, which are made out of these grains, and to make sure that they're not from this year, but they're from the former year, right? Right. So if you're, let's say, drinking beer in February, you're drinking beer in February, and that beer is obviously, more than likely it's from this season. So we might want to drink beer only from summer. Only in the summer we might want to drink beer, because the winter is less likely for it to be kosher. But then there's
kosher beer, so that would mean that they use
right. The question here is, good morning, Ed and Winston on Facebook. Nice to see you both. Ed, we miss you here in shul in the morning. Hope you'll be able to join us. But I want to say this to you, Rob, that the question is, where does it apply? And does it apply to Gentile-owned produce? Which would make life a lot easier for us, right? So let's see. A person has to be strict with himself. A person can be strict upon himself to go according to the stringent opinions who say that the prohibition applies even to Gentile-owned produce, and even in the diaspora, even outside of Israel. That's very stringent, right? There are those opinions in the Code of Jewish Law which say that you don't have to worry about Gentile grain grown in the diaspora, which is like 99.8% of all grain on earth, right? Right? Probably more than that, right? So, however, but since in the diaspora we observe 2 days of Pesach, right? Therefore, the second day of Pesach might be on the second day, or might be on the third day. Because the reason we do 2 days is because we're not sure which is the first day. So, a complicated discussion, but would just suffice it to say that therefore you'd have to wait until the end of the third day of Pesach, because the third day might be the second day. Okay, now, practically speaking, bottom line, and this comes from the Rebbe, we see that the world is not careful with the law of Chodosh in the diaspora at all. So the Rebbe is basically telling us that don't sweat it in the diaspora, and that's why we can drink beer in the diaspora, because as long as it's not a Jewish-owned company, Jewish-owned grain. Well, again, a Jewish-owned company might be buying grain from a non-Jewish farmer, which is fine, again, right? So as long as the grain itself, and then you know how you sell your chametz to a Gentile, maybe you could sell your fields for a Gentile, so it's not Jewish-owned for that period of time, right? Interesting, right? So practically speaking, the Rebbe points out that we don't observe this, we're not stringent with this owned by Gentiles in the diaspora. And the Rebbe actually said in a talk, he said, we see in Brooklyn and in New York and even in Williamsburg that nearly no one is careful with this, with its stringency. It's a stringency. It's not like we're canceling the law. The law certainly applies in the land of Israel by Jewish-owned, but does it also extend to non-Jews in the diaspora or not, right?
The Torah never talked about diaspora because it didn't exist.
Well, it did. It spoke about wherever you live. It did say in your wherever you live. The question is, what does that include? Okay, now, and again, the Torah wasn't written as a human document, Marty, which applies only to a certain time and place. It was written as a timeless document before the world was created. Okay, a living document. It's important to point out that there are places where it's almost impossible to run into a problem, like in the land of Israel, where the produce grows in the winter and the time of harvest is in the spring and summer. So in Israel, you harvest the grain in the spring and summer. Automatically, what that means is that it's going to be okay, because it was harvested
In the summer after Pesach.
The fruit that took root before Pesach was harvested after Pesach. Exactly. And obviously, therefore, you have to be careful wherever you live in some weird place in the world, like in North Queensland, Australia. You got to be careful of what time is when is the harvest and when is the planting, when does it take root, in order that you can be mindful of these laws, right? But at least now we understand the context of what it means to we understand the context of what it means, the laws of grains, right? Of Yashin and Chodesh. Right. So bottom line is that at least we know what it is, and we also know that practically speaking, it's not something which we really need to be worried about here in the diaspora if it's non-Jewish owned, right? So one thing we're a little lenient with, right? Few.
Especially not being farmers. So.
Right. Okay. So let me go straight into some laws of fruits and see how if we can cover this as well, right? Just a new section, the laws of fruits, interesting laws pertaining to fruits, and they go as follows. It says in the Torah in Leviticus chapter 19, and when you come to the land and you plant a fruit-bearing tree, you will, the word for a foreskin, for a bris, is the same word here. Ola. I'm curious to know how they translate it. The word is ola. It's interesting that the tree has 3 years of foreskin, basically, just like here. Here it is. Okay.
Thank God the baby doesn't have to wait 4 years.
No, right.
Well, we do wait 4 years for the baby. We don't a baby boy's hair. We don't cut their hair for 3 years, and it's connected to this law of waiting 3 years before eating the fruits of a tree, because a child is like a tree.
Right.
Okay. So when you enter the promised land and you plant there any tree that produces fruit that can be eaten as food, you must at first block its fruit from use. Its fruit must be blocked. That the word is blocked. Foreskin over here is translated as blocked. Right? I guess like a foreskin blocks. Right? You know the real word for Gentiles is in the Torah is uncircumcised. Right? Uncircumcised is arilim, which in this case would translate as blocked. I mean that's like technically the word. Its fruit must be blocked from your use for 3 years, which you must count from the time the tree was planted. The fruit produced by the tree during these 3 years must not be eaten even after these 3 years have passed. It's treif. You can't eat it. It's like holy. In the 4th year, in all its fruit produced that year will be holy. In that, it must be either brought to the temple city and eaten there in Jerusalem, or redeemed monetarily. Let's say you live in Palm Beach. So you buy your 4th year tree, the 4th year fruit. You sell the fruit, and you take the money. You redeem the money monetarily. You redeem the fruit for money because you can't eat the fruit. In the latter case, the money must be brought to the temple city and be used to purchase food that you consume there. So you spend it on a restaurant in Jerusalem, right? It's economic stimulus for Jerusalem. The same way the second tithe is also the Meiser Sheni. There's a second tithe which is holy in the sense that it has to be eaten by you in Jerusalem. The purpose of requiring you to visit the temple city is so that being there, you will be inspired to offer praises to God. It's great, fantastic. It gives us a reason to go to Israel, right? Instead of going to I don't know, Mauritius or Hawaii or something every year, you go to Jerusalem. You get your focus on. In the 5th year, you may eat its fruit freely. From then on, its fruit is subject only to the other rules applicable to produce, since I know that you may resent having to care for the tree for 4 years without being allowed to eat its fruit, either at all for the first 3 years or freely in the 4th year. I therefore inform you, says God in the Torah, that as a reward for observing these restrictions, the fruit of the subsequent years will be both exceptionally abundant and exceptionally satisfying. Furthermore, whereas you must usually fulfill my commandments without regard to any reward you might earn thereby, in this case, you may fulfill these commandments expressly in order that the tree increase its produce for you in its subsequent fruit-bearing years. I am God, your God, signed, who may be relied upon to fulfill my promise in this regard, right? It's like I am Joe Biden and I endorse this message, right? I am God and I endorse this message.
Very poor analogy.
Yeah, whatever. But like the political endorsements, right? So this is the basis of the law of Orla. Orla is the fruits of a tree, first 3 years of its life, and the 4th year of the tree's life. You don't eat it. You're not allowed to eat. So it applies in every time, every place, and every culture. Let me tell you in a second. So it applies everywhere in the diaspora and always, whether it's a tree owned by a Gentile or owned by a Jew, except that the Orla of Israel is biblically prohibited. And the Orla of the diaspora is halacha l'Moshe Sinai is only is prohibited. Israel is prohibited by clear divine law. and the diaspora is by Mosaic tradition. Moses' tradition received from Mount Sinai in the oral Torah, right? Now, you asked, what do we do with the fruits, right? They're holy. It's an interesting question. What do we do with them? We don't eat them. Can you sell them? Can you let them drop on the floor? You have to destroy them? Interesting question. I don't know. Anyways, I am going... What?
If you buy a jar of jam, will it have the same notation like bread, that the fruit is not...
Okay, so I'm going to jump to the end of this because I'm going to finish over here, but I'm going to say this, okay? That even though it applies more strictly than the Chadash and Yashan law of grain, nevertheless, we said that in the diaspora, it's prohibited by... And Marty, I'll get next week to the details of the Arla, right? Next week we'll get to the details of the Arla, of what you're supposed to do with it. But we said that in the diaspora, where it is in effect, it's in effect by Mosaic tradition, by Sinaitic tradition, in the oral law, what Moses received from God at Mount Sinai, not written, but orally, right? So whether it's owned by a Jew or a Gentile, right? But if you're not sure if it's first 3 years or latter, or first 4 years or later in the life, then you can err and assume that it is permissible. And that's why then you can err and assume that it is permissible, right? So what that means is like this, that you go to a I don't know, what do they call them, a green market, right? You don't have to get crazy and find out if you go to Publix, is this apple 3 years old? Or you're asking the guy over there in Publix, how old is this apple? The tree, the mother tree, right? I want to know how old is the mother tree. So you don't have to go into that. You can just buy the apple.
He's going to be able to tell you.
Yeah, as if he's going to know. To right. So we'll get into the details of that next week. But for now, suffice it to say that this is the general introduction to the topic. We'll talk about it more next week. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining me here. There's going to be a great class tonight at 7:30 on JLI on the Zoom. It's about Dira B'Tachtonim, about the ultimate purpose of creation. And we're going to be talking about tonight about the purpose of exile and the purpose of suffering and why life had to be so complicated and so difficult. That's happening tonight at 7:30. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining me here today at 11:30 today. Corey gives a class on Zoom on to men and women on Hebrew language through the Siddur. That's Zoom 11:30, jewishgardens.com/Zoom with Corinne and Nadel. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining me here today. Wishing you all a wonderful day. Shalom.